My name is Kermit Moss. I am on the faculty at Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary. I'm in the area of practical theology, Black church studies, and culture. Today we'll be having a mini lecture, and this mini lecture will center on this theme of race as a theological problem. So the theological underpinnings of racism, particularly in North America and the United States, these theological underpinnings, one, they provide a sense of sanction to racism. So providing sanction to racism is the notion that the divine gives a sense of permission, not only permission, but also there's a sense of authority, or actually authorizes, one, the subjugation of people, two, the oppression of people, and three, this ordering of humanity. What religion does is, broadly, is religion makes meaning of life. It gives one a sense of orientation in life, provides a moral and ethical frame, but also religion orders life. To order life means simply to humans or some things are within a particular disposition or arrangement according to a pattern. So the particular pattern in the racial order is race. So what happens is that humans are ordered within a racial schema or racial hierarchy, and this particular racial hierarchy is given sanction by God. So the order is some measure related to a particular pattern. It's a pattern within creation, and a pattern that is supposed to be a natural pattern. So therefore, racism, or whichever race has a sense of social power, then this race is given normative status. It is centered, and therefore all other racial categories or racial identities, in some measure, they are compared to this one particular racial category, which is, and one scholar would say, becomes or is transformed into co-creator, which means that it moves humanity up to the level of the divine, which is a form of idolatry. So not only is there sanction or divine sanction, but theology in some measure sets the framework for the justification of ideas and beliefs, ideologies of superiority. So superiority, where one group or one group seems itself to be superior while the other group is inferior. What this actually does is that it continues kind of these, I would say, unbalanced relations within social society or civic society. So therefore, I would also add that it extends kind of a Hegelian master-slave relationship between people, which creates a dependency from one group on another group. And so therefore, this notion of divine sanction means this. It's divine sanction and one group, whether that's through the writings of theologians or philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, but one group inherently, by nature, this group, through theological justification, this group inherently is better or superior to others, whether that's intellectually, whether that's morally, or even aesthetically. So what theological sanction also does in terms of the theological underpinnings of racism is it also creates what I would call a sense of racial salvation. So therefore, this notion of redemption, the idea of how one could be redeemed or saved, then salvation is connected to a particular racial description. This particular racial scripture in North America, or particularly the United States proper, would be this notion, I would say, a myth of whiteness. So to be made good, to be made whole, to be a new creation, to be valuable, to be one who has dignity, is really related to its proximity, its conformity, and its, I would say, acquiescence to the notion of whiteness. Religion helps to order life. The racial order orders humans, and what is one of the mechanisms to maintain the racial order? It's what Willie Jennings would call theologies of conquest. Simply put, that theologies of conquest, that it is the misinterpretation, the misapplication of biblical texts for the point of maintaining the social status and the social order. But it is maintained through power. Power is maintained within a framework of honor and shame. This notion of honor and shame is not simply a product of Christian theology or Christian thought, but is embedded within a number of cultures all through the world. And is within this embedment of culture is also connected to religious idea and religious thinking. So this notion of shame is actually the power that is utilized to maintain the social order. Let's give a few historical accounts very briefly on how this takes place. Daniel Theory, he would articulate, or he would ponder, he actually argued that late medieval parishioners, this notion of the social order being connected to the divine, this divine order of life. The social order was so important that it actually not only justifies, but also gave sanction to the notion that violence would be a necessity and would be justified, whether that is physical violence or even signs of verbal violence, for the maintaining of the social order. Why? Because they believe that, according to scholars of the day, they believe that one's sense of identity and who one belonged to was not necessarily connected to the divine, but it was really connected to where they were within the social order or the social strata. So therefore, the logic is that God justifies violence against other people who do not meet the standard, who are not, would be considered non-being versus being. Therefore, God actually legitimizes the use of violence to maintain the social order. This had a sense of theological underpinning. Within, from Jim Crow to throughout the 1950s and 60s, it would be known as the rule of law or the rule of order. So therefore, the sense of honor within a system of honor and shame, and actually, if you look at historically at the ideals and the theological beliefs within not just the North and the South and antebellum, prior to the Civil War and after, it would be related to these particular perspectives. One, that even with the use of violence and the theological justification of violence, that these societies, even those using violence against the other, they actually held the highest ethical standard. Two, the use of violence and theologically sanctioned violence against the other was actually the fulfillment or essential to the natural order that God had established. So it was actually the right use of force for the maintenance of power. So it was theologically justified. And three, because of the necessity of a sense of public reputation and public honor, then to publicly castigate or to humiliate or to even inflict violence on an individual in the name of theology was okay, because this was paramount to the maintenance of the social order. So let's continue to establish this idea of honor and shame. So this idea of honor and shame, the body is the place where shame takes place, but is also the body is the site of power. So therefore, in a theology of power, let's listen to the following. One, as Yolanda Pierce would say, theological language follows kind of the social and the economic situation of the day. Theological language follows those as almost ideological language of those within power. So therefore, theology is reflective of the persons and the motivations of the people. So no theology is neutral. That's the understanding of James Cone. So this idea of power, one, knowledge follows power. Two, the body is the site of power. And three, in order for the body to be maintained its place within a social, I would say a social order, our body is regimented, which means that the body is disciplined. So there's this idea that related to even atonement theories that this notion of violence is okay within civic society because violence helps for the maintenance of God's will. So this is just kind of a brief synopsis of how theology provides the underpinnings of racism. One, it divides divine sanction. Two, it helps to create a sense of superiority of one group over another. Three, it gives groups of people a sense of sovereignty, whether that idea that they have a sovereign right and are invested with sovereign power from the divine to not only to be the stewards, but to dominate the creation. Four, it has this notion of racial salvation. And lastly, it's the notion of supersessionism, which connects to Willie Jennings' idea that within Western society, Jesus' Jewishness is erased and Jesus is some way framed and almost foregrounded into a Western person. So really, really thank you for this opportunity. Please take an opportunity to listen to the lecture by Dr. Willie Jennings, who's at Yale Divinity School, where he elaborates a little bit more on this idea of the origin of race, tracing it through the modern Western theological project. Thank you.